Welcome to the One-Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon, Mosiah chapter 1. Chapter overview: the kingdom has now experienced a period of peace, and King Benjamin has grown old and wants to hand over the kingdom to his son Mosiah. This would be the grandson of the Mosiah mentioned in Omni. So he has them call the people of Zarahemla together for this purpose. Verse 2 tells us that Benjamin has 3 sons, Mosiah, Helaram, and Helamon, and he caused that they should be taught in all the language of his fathers. This doesn't really make any sense because first we have the original King Mosiah forcing all the people of Zarahemla to speak and learn the Nephite language, so everybody already speaks the same language anyway. And of course Mosiah would teach his sons his language. It's the only language he knows. What it sounds like to me happening is Joseph Smith taking his experience of being a settler among other settlers, and these other settlers would often speak foreign languages, German, Dutch, Italian, things like that. And the parents would often not know English very well. The children, of course, would pick it up fairly rapidly because that was the common language spoken. So the children might even not learn the language of their fathers very well unless they were particularly taught it. So that would explain this. But in this context, it makes no sense because the languages wouldn't be very different from each other to start with. They were only a few hundred years removed from each other. And the languages merged into one at the time of King Mosiah. It's just an oddity in the book that presumes to be actual history of the time, but it makes it sound like the writing is too conscious of being fraudulent and trying to make itself fit into ancient times, and failing miserably. Verse 3 says that Benjamin taught his sons the history and prophecy on the brass plates, saying that if they didn't have that information, we must have suffered in ignorance, not knowing the mysteries of God. Then in verse 7 saying, it would have been impossible for Lehi to have remembered everything without the plates, for he, having been taught in the language of the Egyptians, could read the plates and teach his children. This sounds like the Book of Mormon is saying that Lehi wrote in Egyptian, and the Jewish records were likewise written in Egyptian, which of course makes no sense. Why would the Jewish records be written down in Egyptian, especially if they were handed down from times of antiquity, as it sounds, rather than being made new? And if the Mormon claim is true, that the plates that Joseph Smith used to translate the Book of Mormon were written in Reformed Egyptian, then that would mean that all the people who wrote on the records wrote in Reformed Egyptian, even though it wasn't the language of the people, which likewise makes no sense. It ends up sounding like the author is here saying, I'm writing this down so my people have a record of it, but I'm writing it in a language that they can't read or understand unless they specifically learn it. I could write it in our native language of Hebrew, but I won't, and I am insisting on writing it in Egyptian, which almost nobody reads or understands. Yeah, right. The next several verses have Benjamin exhorting his sons to read and understand and remember what is in the plates. Then the king recognizes that he's growing old and will soon die, so he wants to confer the kingdom to one of his sons, and has Mosiah make the proclamation to gather everyone together so he can announce to the people that he's going to give the kingdom to him. Verse 12 is King Benjamin saying that he will give the people a name that never shall be blotted out, except it be through transgression. This sounds like the name given will be something like Nephites or Zarahemlites or some name for the people to be called by. But we find out several chapters later, Mosiah 5, that this name that he gives them is the name of Christ. Of course, saying that this name can be blotted out makes it sound like the name of Christ can be blotted out, but what is meant, albeit very clumsily said, is that if the people transgress, then they lose the right to be called by that name, or something like that. It's never really clear. As I said, clumsy. Verse 13 says that if the people fall into transgression and become a wicked and adulterous people, that the Lord will deliver them up, that thereby they become weak like unto their brethren. Who these brethren are, we aren't told. But the Book of Mormon has identified both Lamanites and other Nephites who were perhaps left behind or killed or were wicked or whatever. Both were called brethren. So it's anybody's guess as to who was meant. If it's the Lamanites, it makes no sense because they're constantly being said to be strong and overtaking the Nephites. So this calls these brethren weak. So perhaps it's talking about the Nephites who fell to the Lamanites, because the next verse says that if God hadn't preserved their fathers, they must have fallen into the hands of the Lamanites and become victims to their hatred. But again, that's talking about fathers, not brethren. So, again, clumsy, anybody's guess. Verses 15 through 16 say that Benjamin gives Mosiah charge concerning all the affairs of the kingdom, and also gives him the records on the plates of brass, the plates of Nephi, the swords of Laban, and the Liahona, that is, the ball or director which led our fathers through the wilderness. And just how did Mosiah and Benjamin get these in the first place? I guess we're just supposed to believe that the original Mosiah, the grandfather of the current one in this Mosiah 1, just stole them from the royal treasury. We're not told he's a royal or a direct descendant of Nephi, or we're not given any reason for him to have these. They just are Nephi's back in 1st Nephi and 2nd Nephi, and then next thing you know, they pop up in Zarahemla. And where do they come from? We just don't know. It makes no sense. Finally, in verse 18, we're told that Mosiah does as he's commanded and calls all the people to the temple on the next day to hear from his father. This is the first time that the temple is mentioned in the land of Zarahemla. It just pops up into existence out of nowhere, which is odd considering how important the temple is, especially in Mormonism. Remember that when the first Mosiah, the present Mosiah's grandfather, first came to Zarahemla, they were all atheists who knew nothing about God or the Creator. We are never told when a temple was built, but you'd think such an important thing would have been mentioned at least somewhere. But it isn't.